Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I think we have a problem going on with Ebola. Ebola is now spreading rapidly across the Congo, with cases continuing to climb. What I want to propose is this. I've been talking about a kill box. A kill box is a defined geographic area where military forces are authorized to attack enemy targets without getting separate approval for every individual strike. In simple terms, commanders draw a box on a map and say, within this area, enemy forces can be targeted under the established rules. I think what we're looking at in Africa in general is a giant kill box going on. Let me read a quote first from Tedros, the head of the WHO. Trust must be earned. It cannot be assumed. We have not always done things correctly. And that was WHO Director Tedros, May 28, 2026. So he said in his own statement that trust must be earned. It cannot be assumed. We have not always done things correctly. Trust is built when people can question authorities, refuse interventions, understand what is being done and why, see their families, maintain dignity around death and burial, and have meaningful participation in decisions affecting their communities. That is particularly important in Ebola responses. When frightened communities encounter outsiders arriving with protective suits, isolated procedures, blood collection, vaccination programs, contact tracing, and restrictions on traditional burials, saying you need to trust us isn't quite enough. In fact, the lesson is almost the reverse. You don't get cooperation first and earn trust later. You earn trust first and cooperation follows. So when he says we have not always done things correctly, what specifically does WHO believe it did incorrectly? And then there's a second question right behind it. If WHO knows trust must be earned, what has it actually changed to earn the trust of people in the Congo? Does the war explain WHO's difficulty earning trust? Or has the war become a convenient reason not to examine why that trust was lost in the first place? Yes, in the Congo, the trust problem predates the current Ebola response by generations. Colonial rule, forced labor, extraction of resources, political interference, wars, foreign military involvement, NGOs, and repeated international interventions, all from the backdrop against which people encounter WHO and other outside organizations. So Tedros isn't speaking to a population that began with a neutral level of trust and then became suspicious because somebody mishandled an Ebola response. The historical starting point is already profoundly complicated. In this sentence, trust must be earned. It cannot be assumed. Precisely, why would anyone have assumed it in the first place? And if the institution acknowledges we have not always done things correctly, the next question becomes even more important. What did you do wrong? And what have you changed? Without answers to those two questions, talking about building trust risks becoming public health language rather than an accounting of what actually happened. Tedros says we have not always done things correctly. Fine, then what did WHO get wrong? And give the people of the Congo one concrete example of what WHO will do differently this time. There is documented evidence that armed security forces were used in the 2018 to 2020 Eastern Congo Ebola response, and in some instances, force was used against patients. The strongest evidence I found is a 2019 New England Journal of Medicine account from physicians working in the response. They reported that vaccination and outreach teams sometimes operated with armed military escorts and wrote that they had personally witnessed armed guards forcibly bringing patients into treatment. They also reported substantial community fear of forced vaccination, where security forces accompanied Ebola teams. So on August the 6th, and right now we're August the 25th, the Africa CDC said the response was moving away from relying primarily on ordinary contact tracing and toward actively searching communities door to door for people with symptoms. At that point, the DRC has over 3,973 cases and 1,801 deaths. Africa CDC said the count had already passed 4,000. So they're already admitting that right here, that they're already starting to go door to door. Okay, they're just leaving off certain words here. Burials are another matter. Reporting from many documented police and soldiers at Ebola burials. In one case, mourners wanted to see a girl's body. The burial team refused. Tensions escalated, and police and soldiers fired into the air and dispersed the mourners. The same investigation obtained notes in which a local WHO representative reportedly advocated using police or the army to take bodies when families refused safe burial procedures. WHO responded that it did not recommend using force. You hear those words? It did not recommend using force, but while at the same time they're using force already, right? And WHO itself acknowledges how intrusive the system was. Its review describes solitary treatment, contact tracing, vaccination, and control over burials, explicitly recognizing that these interventions touch deeply personal and cultural significant parts of people's lives. WHO later highlighted redesigned treatment units that allowed families to see their relatives safely and more easily. Yeah, basically what they were doing is they went in with their arms and their guards, they rounded up people, they hauled them off to treatment places, supposedly. The families could not have any kind of contact. The families could not have any input into how these people were buried. And now they're wondering, how did we lose the trust? This is almost hard to really believe and grasp, right? People weren't merely being asked to trust unfamiliar health workers. In documented instances, Ebola teams arrived with armed escorts, armed agents, forcibly brought patients into treatment, and security forces became involved in disputes surrounding burials. That history makes Tedros's 2026 comment, "We have not always done things correctly," considerably more interesting. The obvious follow-up really is this what he is talking about? The people who helped create the trust problem are now presenting themselves as the people who will solve the trust problem. That doesn't automatically mean they can't solve it, but it certainly means they need to demonstrate why anybody should believe the next approach will be different. Dr. Jean Kasseya, Kasseya, put that name in your hat, who now runs the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also called the African CDC. So the person on the ground making the decision for the people from Africa is indeed an African doctor, okay? And he runs the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. But there's always a big but here, right? Kasseya is a doctor from the DRC. Over his career, he has worked with several of the biggest organizations involved in health programs across Africa, including the World Health Organization, who are you going to call? UNICEF, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Clinton Health Access Initiative. He also worked directly inside the Congo's health system, including overseeing routine childhood immunization programs, He later served as a senior health advisor to Congolese President Laurent Kabila. So, Kaisenia did not arrive at Africa CDC as an outsider. His career connects him to the Congo government, vaccination programs, and major international health organizations that have operated across Africa for decades. Today, he sits at the top of Africa CDC, the African Union's continental-wide public health agency. So that is the guy in charge. He sounds like an insider to me, but that is just my opinion. And I want to clarify something that I find strikingly odd. When I was talking about the case with when they were using the ivermectin in Africa, okay, that got started in New Guinea, right? Well, there's two Guineas. And now remember, these people are the ones that are all about the codes, the horoscopes, and all that stuff. So we need to take a look at these two Guineas. So these two Guineas are actually not even located close together. So supposedly, one of these things for the give me a second here. One of these things for the Ebola got started in Guinea. And remember, the Psychospora, that worm got started in New Guinea. So we have two Guineas involved here, and neither Guineas are located close to each other, okay? So first, let's look at the linguistic root usually proposed for Guinea. That's Guinea, is the Berber word agayo, which means black person or black people. Isn't it interesting that Guinea means black people? So there's also forms of, let me see, in Portuguese, it was Guiane, which means Guinea. So the root is agana, which is Aginaw, and that is referring to a black African person. I don't know. They find two diseases, which I'm proposing these viruses are all basically cooked up, right? So these same two viruses just happen to be from a region called Guinea, not necessarily close on a map, right? So I'm going to be reading this article about these viruses, and this person is very interesting. I put all their links down below. They actually have their own blog, and they created the blog after they realized that a relative of theirs had been injured, and they realized that this virus thing is all a hoax. So let me just read directly. However, looking into first of all, there's two viruses. They claim it started with the Marburg, Marburg virus. And then they say, oh, wait a minute, now it's the Ebola. So this is how this is how you never really get a straight answer, right? Because I went round and round and round over this Marburg virus and the Ebola virus. And now they're saying it's another new Ebola virus. So it's my view that if you throw enough confusion into the thing, well, it becomes hard to really figure out did that person really have this disease or not. So it all started with the Marburg virus, okay? So let me start reading this article again. However, looking into the Marburg virus outbreaks tells an entirely different story. This is only the second reported outbreak of the Marburg virus in West Africa, a place of where it was unheard of before. The first appearance in this region of what is considered a highly contagious virus, and they have that in air quotes, said to spread through contact with bodily fluids, was a single case reported in Guinea last year. Similar to the recent monkeypox outbreak, the patients diagnosed with Marburg in Ghana had no relation to each other, no travel history to endemic countries, nor any contact with any animals said to carry the virus. Both were farmers who reported nonspecific symptoms such as diarrhea, fever, nausea, and vomiting. Sadly, they both succumbed to their symptoms after treatment at the hospital. The final toll of this outbreak of this highly contagious virus was limited to 4 people. How did a highly contagious virus, which has never been seen in West Africa before, make its way to that part of the continent where those infected had no history of travel to an area where the virus is said to be endemic? How did this deadly virus only infect 1 person in Guinea in 2021 and only 4 in Ghana in 2022 if it is highly virulent and contagious? In fact, in the vast majority of its history, the Marburg virus has shown that it is anything but highly contagious, with the highest outbreak occurring in Angola in 2004 with only 252 cases. If we are to go by the CDC's own data, there have only been 475 total cases of this highly contagious virus worldwide since its discovery in 1967. Those statistics do not seem to jibe with the definition of an endemic-prone, highly contagious, highly virulent virus. So what is the story behind the Marburg virus? When and how did this dangerous pathogen burst onto the scene? What new symptoms of disease originally prompted the search for a novel etiological agent? What methods, if any, were employed in order to purify, isolate, and characterize the particles assumed to be the virus? Let's see what we can uncover about the first virus discovered it's called the Flovarian family, Filviridae family. According to the CDC, the Marburg virus was discovered in 1967 after an outbreak of symptoms commonly associated with hemorrhagic fever occurring among laboratory workers conducting research who had come in contact with African green monkeys. It is one of 7 species of filovirus and the other 6 belonging to separate versions of the Ebola virus. The symptoms of the disease associated with the Marburg virus are nonspecific and overlap with many different diseases, such as malaria, typhoid fever, or dengue, or any of the viral hemorrhagic fevers that may be endemic to a specific area. This obviously makes clinical diagnosis difficult, i.e., impossible, due to the similarities between the diseases. In other words, there is nothing new nor specific regarding the Marburg virus, as it is just another in a long chain of names given to the same symptoms of disease. Marburg virus disease, or MVD, is a rare but severe hemorrhagic fever which affects both people and non-human primates. MVD is caused by the Marburg virus, a genetically unique zoonotic or animal-borne RNA virus of the filovirus family. The 6 species of Ebola virus are the only other known members of the filovirus family. Marburg virus was first recognized in 1967 when outbreaks of hemorrhagic fever occurred simultaneously in laboratories in Marburg and Frankfurt, Germany, and in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. 31 people became ill, initially laboratory workers, followed by several medical personnel and family members who had cared for them. 7 deaths were reported. The first people infected had been exposed to Ugandan imported African green monkeys or their tissues while conducting research. One additional case was diagnosed retrospectively. Clinical diagnosis of Marburg virus disease, or MVD, can be difficult. Many of the signs and symptoms of MVD are similar to other infectious diseases such as malaria, typhoid fever, or dengue, or viral hemorrhagic fevers that may be endemic in the area. This is especially true if only any single case is involved. So yeah, well, they're arguing that the virus is pretty questionable, right? So let's take a look at these guineas. Excuse me. There are two guineas. I love odd details, so hang in there. Comparable to the state of Maryland, the one Guinea has an estimated population of 1.6 million, mainly split between larger continental portions and the island of Bioko, 100 miles to the northeast, where the capital city, Malabo, is located. Travel between Equatorial Guinea and the U.S. is rare, with most air travelers transitioning through Spain. Marburg virus has been most frequently found in Uganda and Kenya around Lake Victoria. The fatality rate in previous outbreaks has averaged close to 80%. The largest Marburg virus outbreak occurred in 2004 and 2005 in Angola, resulting in 374 cases. The disease is transmittable from person to person. In the last 2 years, there have been detections in Ghana in 2022 and Guinea in 2021 in West Africa. In late March, a new outbreak of Marburg virus disease was reported to the northwest corner of Tanzania on the shores of Lake Victoria. There have been 9 reported cases to date. It is unclear whether this outbreak is related to the one in Equatorial Guinea. But the geographical separation is 1,500 miles. So I don't know. I think for some weird reason, and I can't really, I don't know what makes these people think, okay, as far as all these things about the dates and the names and stuff. But they love all these word symbols, right? So I don't know. Why did it happen in 2 different Guineas? You'd have to ask one of them because I'm kind of stumped. So what is the Marburg virus? The Marburg virus is a filovirus and a cousin of the Ebola viruses, causing a hemorrhagic fever similar to that of the Ebola virus. Like Ebola, it can be transmitted from person to person, typically through close contact with people who are very sick. Many people infected in Equatorial Guinea appear to have contact with human remains at funeral ceremonies. You hear the words, right? Many people, and they appear to have, right? Very vague wording. So if you think this is confusing, you have to understand I went through days of trying to figure out this Marburg versus the Ebola deal. And I think that's part of the deal, right? Make it kind of confusing so you can't really, because, it must be something else. You're hanging around your village in Africa. You got the flu or something going on. Maybe you had I don't know, maybe you ate something bad the night before. You're not feeling well. And all of a sudden, knock, knock, knock on your door comes these health workers. And maybe they come with people with guns and stuff. And they want to know what your health is like. And you say, well, gee, I just threw up this morning. That's a symptom. So really anything can be a symptom. So let me keep trying to unfinagle this Marburg stuff. So because I was all the way down the road on Ebola, and then I realized that Marburg, when I went to look for the first virus, that's when I stumbled on Marburg. And in all of this stuff I'm going over today, I have left Japan to the side. I'll cover Japan at the very end, because really what's happening here is that they all got together for the first case with the ivermectin in Africa, right? And from that point forward, they then had the chain of command and the things rolling forward to hit Ebola. Because I was merely looking at a timeline. I'm always talking about timelines, right? And I thought, hey, wait a minute. Why? Because they just announced that Ebola is spreading like wildfire in the Congo. So I pulled out a timeline and I thought, wait a minute. Ebola got started right after the last incident, and the same players are in charge of Ebola. They were in charge of the last thing. So we have a real pattern of these groups of people. So essentially, not every single person, but the same people involved in the virus, the one that came out of Unit 731 in Japan, that same group of people who came up with ivermectin are the same group of people who are in charge of this Marburg Ebola thing going on now. So, yeah. So it's my view, you kind of get this kind of confusing, and then you can diagnose everybody, right? So let's get back to the facts here. So how is the Marburg virus transmitted and spread? And now they've had a change, okay? So they're saying that fruit bats, those poor bats, they always like those bats, right? Fruit bats are considered natural hosts for the Marburg virus, but the virus can also infect primates, pigs, and other animals. Human outbreaks likely start when a person has direct or indirect contact with an infected animal. You see how fuzzy this gets? So did you have direct or indirect contact? They both qualify, right? So Marburg virus can spread through broken skin or mucous membranes, blood secretions, organs, or other bodily fluids of infected people, bedding, clothing, or surfaces contaminated with bodily fluids of infected people, direct contact with an infected deceased body. So where did Marburg really come from originally? That's the key question here. And this is what leads me to suspicions over Marburg virus probably got created in some lab, right? Now, obviously, I can't prove that because I don't work in a lab, but it sounds to me like Marburg virus got created in some lab, but not just some lab, a lab in Germany. So, Marburg virus disease was initially detected in lab workers working with African green monkeys imported from Uganda in 1967. Concurrent outbreaks occurred in Marburg and Concurrent outbreaks occurred in Marburg and Frankfurt in Germany and Belgrade in Serbia. But the virus got its name from Marburg, Germany. Because it was found at a lab, supposedly from some African green monkeys imported from Uganda to a lab in Marburg, Germany. Yeah, nothing suspicious about any of this so far. So, what are symptoms of Marburg virus disease? Marburg virus disease begins abruptly after an incubation period between 2 to 21 days. Severe disease can appear between 5 and 7 days from the start of symptoms. Similar to Ebola, symptoms include high fever, severe headaches, extreme fatigue, and typically occurring on or by day 3, symptoms become severe and include watery diarrhea, abdominal pain and cramping, nausea and vomiting. After this phase, bleeding begins to occur. So there is no vaccine or antiviral treatment for the Marburg virus. But development with clinical trial consideration is underway. And this is what's also interesting about this Ebola thing, is right there in the Congo, a war is going on, right? Complete war is taking place. And in the middle of that war, they're running around, and now they're running around looking for people with either Marburg or Ebola. I'm kind of confused. I think they're looking for people with Ebola. And so then they're going to be isolated. See, what I'm saying is, it seems like a lot of activity for one area, right? So what they claim is using high quality surveillance and case detection, finding and isolating sick and infected people, tracing their contacts, and quarantining contacts help prevent transmission. So, yeah, in plain English, Marburg and Ebola are filoviruses that cause hemorrhage, multiple organ failure, and high mortality rates. Doctors confirm Marburg or Ebola by testing a patient's blood. They can look for pieces of the virus itself, the PCR, look for viral proteins or the body's antibodies against the virus, that's the ELISA, or actually see virus particles with a powerful electron microscope. So, and then they claim after they diagnose it using this high-powered microscope, treatment is then supportive. This means there isn't necessarily a drug that simply kills the virus. Doctors keep the patient alive while the body fights it, giving fluids, replacing electrolytes, maintaining oxygen and blood pressure, and treating bleeding or organ problems. So the reason they claim they need this isolation and quarantine is this, because infected blood and body fluids can transmit the virus. Sick patients are separated from others, and caregivers use protective equipment. People who have been exposed may be monitored and have their contact with others restricted, depending on the circumstances, to stop additional infections. This kind of reminds me of the old divide and conquer, right? Get those people you claim are sick off, isolated on their own, right? So, what is the Marburg virus and where did it come from? Marburg virus causes the Marburg virus disease, formerly known as the Marburg hemorrhagic fever. The virus, which belongs to the same family as the Ebola virus, causes severe viral hemorrhagic fever in humans with an average case fatality of around 50%. It has varied between 24 to 88% in different outbreaks, depending on virus strains and case management. It was first reported in 1967 in a town called Marburg in Germany and in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. There were simultaneous outbreaks in both cities. It came, it came from monkeys imported from Uganda for laboratory studies in Marburg, Germany. The laboratory staff got infected as a result of working with materials like the blood, tissues, and the cells of the monkeys. Of the 31 cases associated with these outbreaks, 7 people died. After the initial outbreaks, and this is important, now remember, these initial outbreaks happened in Germany, right? Other cases have been reported in different parts of the world. Most were in Africa, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, South Africa, and more recently in Guinea and Ghana. Serological studies have also revealed evidence of past Marburg virus infections in Nigeria. While the host or reservoir of the virus is not conclusively identified, the virus has been associated with fruit bats. In 2008, two independent cases, I read that right. I didn't say 2000, I said two. In 2008, two independent cases were reported in travelers who had visited a cave inhabited by rosarette bat colonies in Uganda. So, well, I don't know what to tell you. From what I can tell, it started with those monkeys in a lab in Marburg, Germany, okay? And it spread. And somehow it spread back to Africa. I'm a little bit fuzzy on how that actually worked. So, because after an incubation period of between 2 to 21 days, that really covers a lot of things, doesn't it? There is a sudden onset of the disease marked by fever, chills, headache, and malaria. Around the fifth day after the onset of symptoms, yeah, things get worse, right? So, yeah, I don't know, because cyclosporia started with 3 patients, and this one started with 2. See, this is another point that I find a little bit suspicious. Well, I find it highly suspicious. They find like 2 cases and go, yep, that's it. That's it. Got those 2 cases. Because cyclospora, remember, that started with 3 patients in Papua New Guinea, another Guinea location. So, in Papua New Guinea, 1977 to 78, a strange organism found in stools, initially classified incorrectly, eventually identified and named cyclosporia from Papua New Guinea. So, yeah, you had the Marburg in Ghana. There were 2 initial patients. In 2022, both of them died. They were initially tested positive, but the source of their infections were unknown. Subsequent investigations changed the official case count because the test was tested positive, but it was really not positive. So see where this gets kind of confusing? Because both cases, very small number of people through whom something first comes to the attention of medicine and public health, rather than proof that the disease itself literally began with those people. So yeah, how they discover these things, I consider it highly, highly suspect. So long before Ebola, international health organizations had built extensive African networks for mass drug administration, disease surveillance, and community-directed treatment, including those Ivermectin programs. During Ebola outbreaks, international responders repeatedly relied upon repurposed existing community health and disease control infrastructure. Yeah, and that's what really caught my eye, because literally within 2 years, they were at the Ebola thing, right? And I thought, whoa, 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 wait a minute here. So, yeah, so surprisingly, little historical work appears to have asked how much personnel and institutional continuity existed between those earlier programs and the Ebola response. I gotta tell you, it has been seamless. I'm telling you, seamless, because the program they set up for ivermectin is the same program they're using for the Ebola response. Of course, using the same program makes sense in any case, right? But when you're conducting what I would consider a eugenics program, it brings another relevant question to mind, right? So why exactly did these 2 diseases kind of go neck to neck, right? So So some people, myself included, may look at this system and see something that smacks of colonialism. These enormous public health systems were often designed, financed, studied, and promoted by international institutions, foreign governments, foundations, and pharmaceutical interests, and then implemented across some of the poorest communities in Africa. There was no continent-wide public vote asking ordinary Africans, do you want international organizations building this kind of permanent health delivery structure inside your communities? Instead, participation was generally organized through governments, health ministries, local officials, chiefs, health workers, and community organizations. Supporters would call that community participation and point out that many local people actively participated in and benefited from these programs. But critics can ask a different question. Who ultimately designed the system, controlled the money, established the research priorities, and decided what interventions would be delivered? And there is an uncomfortable racial and historical dimension that shouldn't simply be dismissed. The United States and Europe have repeatedly been forced to confront their own histories of racism, colonialism, medical experimentation, and paternistical treatment of Black populations. So when predominantly Western institutions arrive in African countries, establish enormous health programs, study how communities respond, develop methods for increasing participation, and then use what they learn to expand those systems to additional interventions, it is reasonable to ask this question. Would we describe this quite so comfortably as community directed if the same system were being constructed across millions of communities in the United States or Europe? And given the history, the question of power cannot be separated from the question of public health. Who decides? Who pays? Who benefits? Who controls the system? And most importantly, how much genuine control do the people living inside these communities actually have? I want to make my position perfectly clear before I go any further. This history deserves more than a casual look. We're talking about enormous international organizations, governments, pharmaceutical companies, and foundations making decisions that ultimately reach people living in African villages. Who gave them that authority? Who decided what these communities needed? Who controlled the money, the research, and the interventions? And how much real power did the people themselves have to say no? My favorite saying is this: evil has to come packaged as help. And after looking at this history, I personally see something deeply wrong here. I see something that raises questions about colonialism, racism, and power. You don't have to agree with my conclusion, but I think you have to look at the structure before dismissing the question, who is helping whom, and who gets to decide what help looks like? If this was happening in your community, would you call it help? Okay, now that we have a little bit of the history, let's take a look at 2026. What do we have going on there now? Well, there's war and insecurity, armed conflict, population displacement, attacks on health facilities, and highly mobile populations are interfering with surveillance and contact tracing. There's been an unusually severe outbreak. As of August the 24th, and we're right now at August the 25th, The Associated Press reports 5,514 confirmed cases and 2,642 deaths, making this the fastest growing Ebola outbreak recorded. The virus is different. This outbreak is caused by this thing called the Bungalaya Ebola virus. And I'll spell that. It's BUNDIBUGYO, Ebola virus, not the Zaire Ebola virus responsible for the enormous 2014 to 2016 West African epidemic and the major 2018 to 2020 Congo epidemic. So now we're looking at a completely new virus called the Bundibugyo Ebola virus. So that means there's no approved Bundibugyo specific vaccines. The World Health Organization says there is currently no licensed vaccine specifically for Bundibugyo Ebola disease. So they're testing an existing Ebola vaccine. Congo has received 16,250 doses of Merck's vaccine. Is called the Ervebo, ERVEBO. So right there in the middle of the war zone, they claim that, well, this virus is different. It's different from the last couple ones. And we have no specific vaccine. And they're testing an existing Ebola vaccine in the Congo right now with everything else going on. So Merck is in the picture here again, right? And they have 70,000 doses have been promised. Ervebo was developed and approved for the Zaire Ebola, not the Bundibugyo. Researchers are now testing whether it provides a useful cross protection against this different Ebola virus. And they're simultaneously testing treatments. Experimental therapeutics are being evaluated because there is also no approved specific treatment for Bundibugyo Ebola. And other vaccines are being developed at the same time. Moderna has begun human testing of a vaccine specifically aimed at Bundibugyo Ebola. So yes, so they aren't simply giving people an old Ebola vaccine and assuming it works. They're taking an existing vaccine proven against one Ebola virus, and that is called Ivermectin, ERVEBO, and conducting a clinical trial during the outbreak to determine whether it also protects people against the Bundibugyo Ebola. So that seems quite extraordinary to me. The outbreak response and the scientific experiment are happening simultaneously. At the same time, doctors are trying to stop transmission. Researchers are trying to determine which vaccine and which treatments actually work against the virus causing it. And that was just from a couple of days ago, okay? So clearly a lot of confusion, right? Because now we have this Bundibugyo Ebola. So what do I think is likely causing all of this? Well, I think it's probably a very simple thing. Follow the money. The U.S. Commerce Department, their current DRC market guide, updated in February of 2026, says this: most of the country's mineral resources remain untapped and are estimated to be worth $24 trillion. That includes enormous deposits of cobalt, copper, gold, diamonds, coltan, tantalum, tin, tungsten, lithium, and other strategic minerals. The Commerce Department from the USA also notes that the DRC is the world's largest producer of cobalt, and it's estimated to be $24 to $25 trillion of wealth right under that same land where Ebola is now spreading like fire. Huh. I wonder why this is all happening there. Very, very interesting, right? That one area there seems to be the target. I think what happened was ivermectin was the training ground, and how the river blindness campaign built a community health model later used in African epidemic responses. The enormous African ivermectin campaign did considerably more than distribute drugs for river blindness. Over several decades, the program helped international health organizations, African governments, NGOs, and local communities develop and refine a system for reaching millions of people in remote areas where conventional health infrastructure was weak. WHO's own historical documents make this point unusually clear. The important distinction is this: there is no evidence that the ivermectin program was created in preparation for Ebola, but there is strong evidence that the ivermectin campaign became a large-scale laboratory for learning how community-directed health initiatives could operate across Africa, and that WHO deliberately studied how the system could be expanded beyond ivermectin. Because it all started off back with ivermectin. I'm not going to drag us through the whole thing. I'll post a link to the show. If you haven't heard my show about ivermectin, you're missing a big part of this picture. So I will continue on. In the beginning, Merck was the one who announced its ivermectin donation program in 1987, promising to provide what's called Mestixan for river blindness for as long as necessary. So they gave away millions of shots, right? They got all those community leaders. In other words, ivermectin required the construction of a community-level public health delivery system. WHO itself later described the collaboration surrounding mass ivermectin treatment as creating a unique community-based distribution system. So yes, that is exactly how it all got started. It got started with the program for the blindness, the African Program for Onchogenesis Control, or APOC, and that's when it was established. This was not a small operation. It brought together African governments, affected communities, NGOs, donors, and international organizations. The World Bank, served as fiscal agent and WHO as executing agency. Eventually, approximately 20 African countries participated. The central strategy became known as a community-directed treatment with ivermectin, or the CDTI. Instead of international workers simply arriving in villages and handing people medicine, communities participated in organizing the distribution themselves. In 1995, the World Health Organization's Tropical Disease Research Program pioneered a community-based system in which local residents themselves distributed the ivermectin. In 1996, the African Program for River Blindness adopted that same system. After that, if needed, we can call it simply community-directed ivermectin distribution. This was important because ivermectin treatment had to continue year after year. WHO researchers, therefore, weren't simply asking, does ivermectin work? They were also studying, how do we get an intervention repeatedly into remote African communities and keep the system functioning for years? Almost like they could see down the road. Oh, what do I see down the road? Oh, Ebola. Yeah, just like they could see down the road, right? And they learned from the process. The WHO documents explicitly describe research into the strengths and weaknesses of this delivery system. And all of this information is available online. You just have to have the interest and the will to slug through all the paperwork. But this has all been confirmed. I have had zero reason to go to the dark side of the web and start searching alternative theories because it's right here in writing, right in front of all of us, right? Because researchers then examined communication between health workers and communities. They studied the community participation. They studied the sustainability. They experimented with meetings bringing together villagers, community organizations, and health workers. They measured treatment coverage. They examined why some communities participated and others didn't. They studied how the system could be maintained for 15 years or longer. WHO's 2000 multi-country evaluation describes precisely this process of testing and refining the CDTI. This is why describing the Ivermectin campaign simply as a drug distribution program misses an important part of its history. It was simultaneously producing practical knowledge about how to conduct enormous community-level health interventions in Africa. And let the killing fields begin, they said. Then something important happened. Other disease control programs noticed that ivermectin system worked. So by 2003, WHO was openly studying something that is extremely relevant to later history. WHO reported the success of the CDTI in rubber blindness control had caught the attention of other disease control programs. WHO found that ivermectin community distributors were already being used for activities involving vitamin A, malaria, polio immunization, guinea worm eradication, nutrition, water protection, and generally community health work. More than 50% of the community-directed ivermectin distributors examined in an earlier investigation were already participating in other health and development activities. That was an important turning point. The ivermectin infrastructure was already becoming multi-purpose health infrastructure. In 2005, WHO formally tested the idea. The WHO and APOC went further. In 2005, they launched a 3-year multi-international study asking whether communities experienced with ivermectin distribution could use the same community-directed system to deliver additional health interventions. That study covered approximately 2.35 million people at 7 research sites in Cameroon, Nigeria, and Uganda. WHO explained why it undertook the study. Community-directed ivermectin treatments had demonstrated that health programs could successfully reach enormous numbers of people in poor and remote African communities. So the researchers asked this question, could the system be expanded? And of course, the answer was yes, using community-directed interventions. The drug was no longer the defining feature of the model. The delivery system was. And the scale was enormous. By 2000, APOC's community ivermectin program had reached approximately 20 million people in 50,000 communities across 14 countries. By the time of the 2008 research, annual ivermectin treatment through CDTI had researched nearly 60 million Africans. By 2011, WHO described the community-directed system as reaching approximately 98 million people in 24 sub-Saharan African countries. So no matter what you think about my idea as far as Africa is in fact a kill box, it certainly looks that way to me. It looks like the entire population is really under attack. And when the APOC closed in 2015, WHO reported that community-directed ivermectin treatment was protecting more than 110 million people annually in 19 countries. They institutionalized what they had learned. Perhaps one of the clearest indicators that WHO regarded this as something larger than an ivermectin program came in the next stage. WHO developed a community-directed ivermectin training curriculum for medical and health science schools. WHO explained that experience with ivermectin had demonstrated that communities could manage disease prevention and treatment programs, and that the strategy could efficiently deliver multiple health interventions, particularly in poor and remote communities. By 2009, 18 universities and nursing schools in 11 African countries had agreed to introduce the community-directed intervention strategy into their curriculum. So the progress is documented. They had the ivermectin distribution. That became the community-directed ivermectin distribution, which produced research into community health delivery, which became community-directed interventions for multiple diseases. So yes, they incorporated into training for future African health personnel. And then comes Ebola. When major Ebola outbreaks occurred, particularly the enormous 2018 to 2020 outbreaks in eastern DRC, Congo, responders confronted many of the same operational problems. How do you reach remote communities? How do you establish local surveillance? Who recognizes a suspected case? Who reports it? How do health authorities communicate with villages? Who works with community leaders? How do outsiders overcome mistrust? How do you establish a reporting structure teaching from individual communities into the larger health system? The Ebola response consequently relied heavily upon community health workers and community-based surveillance. One published account of the 2018 to 2020 DRC Ebola response describes establishing a surveillance network using elected community health workers, supervised by stronger performing health workers or local leaders. In that particular program, 247 community health workers and supervisors were trained, with exceptionally high retention and daily reporting. Local chiefs and community leaders were involved from the beginning. So they started with community members, then they had community selected workers, training, supervision, local leadership, connection to the formal health system. So yes, that's how it all set up. And you'll notice when you employ local people, right? Well, what does that happen? These local people, obviously, they're treating poor local people in poor villages, right? So I got to assume the people they're employing to do this health work that came from that same area are likely rather poor themselves, right? Maybe they're not as poor as the rest of the population, but because they went to school and learned to be a nurse or whatever, but you're dealing with a relatively poor population, right? So if you're a nurse or some health worker in the Congo, what are your chances of employment? Well, I don't know. I've never been to the Congo, but I would have to guess being employed would be a little bit tough, right? You got a war going on. You got all this. Is it Ebola? Is it that going on? You got to start running around to villages and doing all this stuff. Now, most people would take the work because they had to, right? Because they also come from poor villages themselves. So I would be cautious to ever blame the local people at their level without knowing more about each particular case, because yes, I think it would be relatively easy to employ people to work in a poor region who are poor themselves, right? Because their incentive becomes hang on to that paycheck, right? So whatever the big guys above them have to say, they're going to follow it, right? Because they're poor and they also, it's not a highly educated area. So there's a lot going against it, right? So the African ivermectin campaign created and refined an enormous community-based health delivery system. Who and its partners deliberately studied what they learned from that system. It's all been documented by themselves, right? In a lot of these cases, these people document what they're doing. All you have to do is learn the key words and have the aptitude to want to dig through a bunch of paperwork, and you can find the answers yourself. You don't need to rush over to social media and start going to some wild theories, because right here, they're admitting themselves that if you believe this was a sketchy deal like I do, well, right here, the killer has pretty much admitted the crime, right? That, yeah, we found this campaign was so successful when we gave these people all that ivermectin that, yeah, we're going to roll this out for Ebola, right? So, yeah, you got them all working together. So, yeah, I would say the crossover is pretty deep, right? You got people in small villages. So, yeah, communication, you got crossover issues. Hey, you got the guy running the CDC who's also in on the deal, so to speak, right? So bottom line is this: ivermectin was not merely a medicine being handed out in Africa. Beginning in the late 1980s, and particularly through APOC after 1995, it became the centerpiece of one of the largest experiments in community-directed public health delivery ever conducted in Africa. Who and its partners learned how to organize communities, select and train local distributors, maintain treatment programs for years, monitor populations, work through local leadership, and connect remote communities with national and international health organizations. They then studied those lessons deliberately. They discovered that the ivermectin system could be used for other interventions, so they expanded it. Then they taught it. And at the same time, major Ebola emergencies are arriving. Africa already possessed decades of accumulated experience with precisely this kind of community-level health organization. You could call that very convenient, or these people had tremendous foresight into the future, or you could call it what I'm calling it, a major kill box, right? Because hear this statement again, and by the time major Ebola emergencies arrived, Africa already possessed decades of accumulated experience with precisely this kind of community level health organization. So, beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating during the 1990s, the campaign against river blindness forced international health organizations, African governments, researchers, and local communities to solve an enormous logistical problem. How do you repeatedly reach millions of people, including people living in remote areas where conventional medical systems have limited reach? So, and whose own historical record shows something important. They learned from the ivermectin experience. They studied what worked. They studied what failed. But you know what they didn't study? They didn't study how to keep and gain people's trust, right? So yeah, so they did all of that, but they never figured out how to get trust into the system, right? Because up until now, armed armed guards and people have forced this all taking place, right? So I believe that what's going to happen next is this language is going to change. They're already talking about, what can we do? It's spreading like wildfire, so we got to go door to door. Well, door to door, well, the next sentence will be, wow, what do you expect us to do? There's a war going on in the Congo, for God's sake, get off our backs. How could we have done anything else? And we're all the terror going on. We're over there. We're trying to study these medications. We're running test trials. We're running experiments. We're trying everything we can. But this Ebola thing keeps changing. Now we got the bugga lugga wugga one to deal with. So, hey, what do we know? We're just here trying to help, right? And that's why I have to repeat. Evil has to come packaged as help. You can't murder an entire population like what I propose is going on with Africa. You do not have to agree with me on this point. I really do not care. But the facts are the facts. A lot of people in Africa are seemingly getting ready to be killed, a whole lot of them again, and they do have a history with handing out medicines and all this stuff in that particular region of the country. So I don't think any of this is like screwy thinking on my part, right? There is a history. They never left Africa. That's what Walter Rodney was trying to tell the world. It was a trick. They said they were leaving, but they never left. And if you don't want more evidence, look at this whole thing that's going on now. By them getting exposed and not having to leave Africa allowed them to stay, build these big networks of people and stuff, right? Feeling free just to wander around into villages and decide who's going to get taken in for health reasons or not, based on what? Some slim things that anybody could have. So you could be sitting in your village in Africa with a sincere case of the flu, or maybe you ate something the night before. Who knows, right? They knock, knock, knock on your door. Next thing you know, you're being hauled off to some sort of treatment facility. They claim they're going to change. Well, look at their history. Up until right now, their history was this. People were taken away by force many times. They were locked up in detention centers. No one could visit or see them. Rumors got going wildly. How do you know that they weren't like extracting all of their organs? And then that's why they didn't want people to see the bodies afterwards, right? So people had ceremonial reasons for how they dealt with the dead. These people just walked in and stomped all over that stuff, right? Said, hey, you get out of here. We're going to take care of it from here. They never, ever started out trying to even get trust to begin with. So to think that they're talking, oh, look at Tedros. He's now saying that, oh, we saw Africa. We didn't mean for this stuff to happen. Sure, we brought around armed guards up until recently. Sure, a lot of people died, but Africa, you've always been on our hearts. Who gave these people the right to do any of this stuff in the first place? Evil absolutely has to come packaged as help. Okay, in this segment, I'm going to be wrapping things up and also take a look at who are some of the overlapping characters in this story here. So, we started out in Papua New Guinea, was one of the places where an international tropical disease establishment developed field expertise. So that's where it all got started. And the same world included Liverpool, WHO, Mass Drug Administration, African disease programs, vector control, and field epidemiology. And then Ebola arrives on the enormous scale in West Africa in 2014, and some of the people who appear in the Ebola response are not newcomers to this system at all. They had already spent decades operating inside the tropical disease network. I have the whole list of them. There's one man in particular, Moses Bokhari. is the clearest example. He connects with Papua New Guinea, ivermectin, and the diseases in the 90s, Sierra Leone, and Ebola in 2014. So there's some crossover with the people involved, but here's the major crossovers that I found. Merck, of course. Merck was involved with ivermectin, that drug called mecticin, and then Merck has also been involved in the Ebola vaccine called Ervebo, Ervebo. So that's Merck's overlap. Johnson and Johnson is interesting. They've done mass treatment and they're also involved in the Ebola vaccine. Glasgow, Smith and Kline, they have developed treatments. Of course, we have the World Health Organization. It also includes the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and that is a big crossover one there. I think this whole virus thing was pretty much, created, let's say, or made up in some lab somehow. And it seems like the same group of people seem to be in this picture also. And that also includes the Papua New Guinea Institute of Medical Research, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, National Institute of Health, Doctors Without Borders, Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, World Bank, UNICEF, United Nations, U.S. Department of Defense. Now, this is an interesting one because Obama declared it a military operation. And then, of course, we have the people out there at Fort Detrick with the USA. They're particularly important because they had studied Ebola and other hemorrhagic fever viruses for decades before the 2014 outbreak and became part of the research and diagnostic infrastructure surrounding Ebola. So, yeah, the U.S. is all over this picture, right? And, of course, the Carter Center. The Carter Center doesn't have as much of a visible impact on this other thing with the Ebola. But they were huge in setting up this whole system for the river blindness and the guinea worm and other African disease programs. So its direct operational Ebola role was much smaller than WHO and all those other people. So, yeah, but the Carter Center was actually key to getting this whole thing set up. So basically, WHO is central to both. Merck is central to both. So we got some things going on. So anyways, now 7 years later, we're seeing the problems again on a very serious scale. Reuters reports widespread mistrust, patients fleeing facilities, attacks on hospitals and ambulances, and more than 260 attacks on health workers in the past 6 months alone. The current outbreak has meanwhile exceeded 5,000 confirmed cases and 2,500 deaths and is still spreading rapidly. So let's talk a little bit about Japan before I close off here. Japan was important at the beginning of the ivermectin story and later became a substantial participant in the international Ebola response system, including repeated work inside the DRC or the Congo. Japan first got over there. I've already covered this extensively in 1978 with the beginnings, all that stuff with Unit 731 and all that, and the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's where Japan entered the picture in 1978. Then in 2014, everybody jumped in the picture then during the enormous 2014 West African Ebola epidemic. Japan became an active participant in the international response. Japanese infectious disease specialists were dispatched to Africa through the World Health Organization. In October 2014, for example, 2 specialists from Japan's National Institute of Infectious Diseases were sent to Sierra Leone as part of a World Health Organization Ebola mission. By November, the Japanese government reported that 10 Japanese experts had participated or were participating in these missions. So Japan wasn't simply writing checks from Tokyo. Japan's personnel were entering the international Ebola response machinery. So by July 2015, Japan reported more than 20 Japanese experts had been dispatched to the World Health Organization missions during the West African Ebola response. And Japan also contributed a lot materially. November 2014, Japan announced that approximately 7,000 sets of personal protective equipment would be supplied to Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Mali. We gotta crack that Guinea case. Why is Guinea in here? It must have something to do with the longitude, the latitude, all these things in these people's minds get drafted into longitude and latitude and this sphere and that sphere and all this kind of stuff. I'll go down yelling about this. Guinea means something in this whole picture because why would there be two guineas in this picture? They have to mean something. So let me continue reading here. Japan even used a self-defense forces aircraft to transport an initial 20,000 sets to Ghana, where the United Nations Ebola emergency mission was headquartered. Yeah, so Japan was really in there. They sent about $155 million in February of 2015. And all of them always want to come in there and bring these drugs in. During the West African epidemic, Japan announced that a drug developed by a Japanese company could be made available under certain conditions as a possible Ebola treatment. Japan also supported clinical testing involving the French Institute of Health and Medical Research, the government of Guinea, and Doctors Without Borders. That means Japan's Ebola involvement extended beyond funding and protective equipment into medical research and experimental treatment. So yeah, in 2015, Ebola produces a permanent Japan outbreak team. So Japan got pretty serious in 2015. After the West African Ebola crisis, Japan established the Japan Disaster Relief Infectious Disease Response Team in 2015. This gave Japan a specialized mechanism for sending infectious disease experts overseas. So yeah, 2014, the Ebola crisis hits West Africa. I said 2014, excuse me. 2015, Japan establishes a specialized international infectious disease response team. 2016, the team goes to the Congo. 2018, the team returns to the Congo specifically for Ebola. 2018, Japanese Ebola specialists enter the Congo. When Ebola broke out in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2018, the Congolese government requested Japanese assistance. Japan first sent an assessment team containing infectious disease specialists, foreign ministry officials, and personnel from Japan's International Development Agency. Japan then deployed a specialized infectious disease response team beginning June 11th of that year. So, yeah, they were pretty heavy into there, right? Japan also provided $3 million for the Congo relief through the World Health, United Nations Children's Fund, and International Organization for Migration. Yeah, I would say Japan is quite involved in the Ebola. So that makes a pretty important connection. Japan, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. Japan says that it contributed heavily to the World Health Organization's emergency response programs after the West African Ebola epidemic. Japan also supported creation of the World Bank's Pandemic Emergency Financial Facility and pledged $50 million, becoming the first country to announce a contribution. Well, either Japan is in on the killing field or Japan happens to like people in Africa, one of the two, right? Is Japan part of the eugenics or part of the rescue team? Well, I'd have to say that Japan looks to me like they're part of the eugenics, right? But throughout this entire show, I keep asking this question. I've been asking it for years. Who are these people? Who makes these decisions? Who funds the programs? Who develops the drugs? Who runs the trials? Who supplies the vaccines? Who establishes the policies? Who shows up in these countries year after year? And maybe, more importantly, you know how to start looking for yourself. I read comments all the time saying things like, well, why doesn't somebody do something? Well, who is somebody? And that is the point. You don't have to be a government agency. You don't have to be a university. You don't have to be a major news organization. You can look, you can read, you can ask questions, you can connect the dots for yourself. So the next time you find yourself saying, why doesn't somebody look into this? Remember, maybe that somebody is you. Why not be kind to the people who actually live there? It's their land. Colonialism never ended. Be safe out there.